Russian truck full of troops was just destroyed by a Ukrainian FPV drone in Lyman, but that strike was not the end. It felt more like the moment that opened something far more troubling than the image of a burning vehicle on the battlefield. Because right after that, what began to appear across the front no longer looked like an isolated attack. Each movement that followed, each attempt to advance, and even the things that were supposed to keep Russian forces safe, started to reveal the same pattern of pursuit repeating itself. As that pattern continued to expand, the question was no longer only how that truck was destroyed. The bigger question was what happened next in Lyman that made the entire area far more dangerous for any vehicle trying to reach the front. Stay with Military Force to find out. What is becoming clear in Lyman is that danger no longer begins only when Russian troops reach the line of contact, because the approach itself is now under attack. Ukrainian UAV teams are repeatedly detecting and destroying vehicles such as UAZ vans, bukankas, Niva-type cars, and motorcycles, all of which are being used to move soldiers and supplies toward forward positions. These are not the most expensive machines on the battlefield, but they are often the most useful. They carry ammunition, water, food, fuel, batteries, tools, and sometimes fresh troops who are needed to reinforce units already under pressure. That is why their loss carries more weight than it first appears. A small transport vehicle may look ordinary, but on a hard-fought front it often serves as the shortest link between the rear and the men holding exposed ground. Once that link is broken, the damage spreads quickly. The soldiers ahead do not receive what they need on time, and the burden on those already in place becomes heavier. In that sense, each destroyed vehicle represents more than one tactical success, because it also shows how the road to the front is being turned into a zone of constant risk. That pattern gives the Lyman sector a meaning that goes beyond individual strikes. The repeated destruction of moving vehicles suggests that Ukrainian drone operators are not simply reacting to targets they happen to spot. They are helping shape the battlefield by turning movement itself into a form of exposure. Even motorcycles, which are often chosen because they are fast, cheap, and able to use narrow paths, are no longer reliable answers. A rider carrying supplies may trust speed to keep him alive, but once detected from above, speed can also make the chase easier to follow. This changes the logic of mobility near the front. The issue is no longer only whether Russian forces can gather enough men and equipment for local assaults. The deeper issue is whether they can move them forward at all without being seen, followed, and struck before they reach the place where they are needed. Lyman therefore looks less like a normal battle zone and more like a widening area of danger where roads, tree lines, and short approach routes all face growing pressure. This matters because a battlefield that punishes movement so consistently does more than destroy vehicles. It slows decisions, disrupts timing, and forces units to spend more effort simply reaching the fight than sustaining it once they arrive. And when even the lightest and most flexible transport can no longer move safely, the next question becomes even more serious. Can anything on the ground still remain hidden for long? What is changing in Lyman is not only how dangerous movement has become, but also how difficult it is for Russian forces to disappear once they stop. For many years, survival on the ground depended on a simple belief that stillness, cover, and rough camouflage could reduce the chance of being found. A vehicle under netting, a position hidden under branches, or troops resting inside a tree line could hope that distance and confusion would protect them. That assumption is now under growing pressure. Ukrainian drones do not watch the battlefield from one fixed angle. They return, circle, compare, and study the same patch of ground again and again. That repeated view changes everything. A hiding place no longer needs to look perfect from eye level. It must survive inspection from above, over time, and under conditions where even small irregularities can begin to stand out. The problem is that concealment often fails not because the target is fully visible, but because the area around it starts to look wrong. Drone operators can spot gaps in tree cover, fresh tracks, disturbed earth, flattened grass, and colors that do not fully match the surrounding terrain. A vehicle may be partly hidden, yet the broken pattern around it can still expose its presence. A cluster of branches placed over metal can seem convincing from the ground, but from the air it may look too ordered, too dense, or too different from natural growth nearby. Even empty space can become a signal. If one part of a forest edge shows a sudden break in shape or rhythm, that change alone may be enough to draw closer attention. This means camouflage is no longer judged only by whether it covers an object. It is judged by whether it can hide the signs that object leaves behind. That is why passive concealment is losing value on a battlefield watched by drones. In earlier phases of war, a unit that stopped moving and stayed quiet could often improve its chance of survival. Now, stillness may only buy time for the observer. If a drone crew suspects a position matters, staying in place can give them more opportunities to confirm what they are seeing. This creates a harder reality for troops on the ground. Turning off the engine, lowering noise, and remaining motionless do not automatically restore safety. The battlefield is being read like a surface full of clues. A wheel mark that leads into brush, a tarp edge that catches light, or a shape that does not belong can all become reasons for another look. Once repeated surveillance begins, the old hope of simply lying still until danger passes becomes much less reliable than before. The larger meaning is that concealment is no longer a single act. It has become a continuous discipline that must begin before arrival and continue after a unit takes position. Troops now have to think not only about what covers them, but also about what traces they leave, how long they stay exposed, and whether their presence slowly changes the ground around them. That is a major shift in battlefield survival. Every pause, every shortcut, and every careless mark can now become evidence visible from above. Lyman is showing that ordinary fieldcraft, while still necessary, is no longer enough on its own when the sky keeps watching. The threat is not limited to obvious targets in open terrain. It also reaches places that once seemed safe enough if men were careful and patient. That is what makes this stage of the fight so serious. And if daylight can no longer guarantee enough protection for troops trying to disappear into the landscape, then the next question becomes even more troubling. What happens when darkness also begins to lose its power to hide them? Night in Lyman is no longer a natural shield for forces trying to move near the front, because thermal drones are turning darkness into an advantage for the side that is hunting. For decades, armies treated the hours after sunset as a period when visibility dropped and units could move with a better chance of avoiding observation. That old assumption is now being challenged. A drone equipped with a thermal camera does not need daylight to find a target. It only needs heat, contrast, and enough time to scan the ground. That changes the meaning of movement after dark. A truck, van, or motorcycle that looks almost invisible to the human eye can stand out clearly on a thermal screen if the engine is still hot. In some cases, motion itself makes detection easier because a moving heat source attracts attention faster than a still patch of darkness. That matters greatly now. This matters because darkness once reduced one of the biggest dangers in ground warfare, which was the chance of being seen before reaching the destination. Now the opposite can happen. At night, the landscape often becomes visually simpler, and that can help thermal optics isolate the one signal that matters most. Heat starts to separate a vehicle from the ground around it. That means darkness is no longer hiding movement in the old way. Instead, it can remove distractions and make the target easier to identify. A vehicle driver may believe that switching to nighttime travel lowers the risk, but the engine, exhaust, and friction from constant movement can still produce a signature that follows the vehicle along the route. What once felt like concealment can therefore become a narrow window of exposure that the enemy is ready to exploit. The longer the route, the greater the danger of exposure. The consequences go far beyond a single strike on one vehicle. When safe movement hours shrink, the pressure spreads across the whole system that keeps frontline positions functioning. Resupply becomes harder to schedule. Troop rotations become harder to organize. Medical evacuation becomes more dangerous at the very moment when speed matters most. A wounded soldier who once might have been moved under cover of darkness now has to be transported through conditions where the vehicle itself can become a signal. The same problem affects ammunition, water, batteries, fuel, and replacement equipment. These are not dramatic battlefield actions, but they are essential daily tasks. If both day and night carry serious risk, then every trip demands more caution, more timing, and more luck. That increases the burden on units already holding exposed ground and forces them to operate under heavier strain. Small delays can now carry much heavier consequences. This is why the change in nighttime conditions has operational meaning, not just visual impact. Commanders can no longer assume that waiting for darkness will solve the problem of exposure. They now have to think about thermal signature, route timing, engine heat, and whether a short movement may still be visible from above. In practice, night planning is becoming a contest of discipline rather than a simple choice of hour. Vehicles may need to pause longer, move shorter distances, or accept added danger when urgent tasks cannot be delayed. Lyman shows that the battlefield no longer gives easy protection to forces that simply wait for the sun to go down. And when neither terrain nor darkness can reliably reduce risk, the next stage of drone warfare becomes even more serious. It no longer ends with seeing targets in motion, because it moves toward waiting for them before they arrive. What is becoming clear in Lyman is that Ukrainian drones are no longer being used only as weapons that strike after spotting movement, because they are increasingly being used to prepare ambushes before the target even arrives. That shift matters because it changes not only where danger appears, but also when it begins. In a normal drone strike, the operator detects a vehicle or a group first and then moves to attack. In a planned ambush, the threat is already in position, and the target enters a space that has quietly been selected in advance. This gives the strike a very different meaning. Success depends not only on fast reactions from the drone team. It also depends on planning, patience, and the ability to read where Russian troops or light vehicles are most likely to pass. That is why roads, forest edges, and short approach routes near the front are becoming so dangerous. This method increases surprise because the target is not being destroyed simply for reacting too slowly. It is being destroyed because it has already stepped into a trap shaped around expected behavior. That creates a different kind of battlefield pressure. A direct strike tells soldiers that they can be seen and hit. An ambush tells them something more disturbing, which is that danger may already be waiting even when the sky seems quiet. That changes how people think about movement. A driver, a rider, or a small infantry group cannot assume that safety exists just because no drone is visible above them at that moment. The real threat may be just ahead on a narrow road, near a tree line, or at the edge of a route used many times before. In that sense, drone warfare is becoming less reactive and more deliberate. Ukraine is shaping the battlefield by predicting how Russia must move, and then placing pressure at the points where that movement becomes easiest to exploit. The larger value of this tactic is not measured only by how many vehicles are destroyed in one day. Its deeper effect lies in how it changes behavior across the whole sector. Once troops believe that drones may be waiting ahead, every route becomes harder to trust. Every crossing point becomes more stressful. Every trip requires more caution, more delay, and more uncertainty. That alone can weaken tempo, slow decisions, and force units to spend more time avoiding danger than completing the task that sent them forward. That is why Lyman shows more than a few successful drone strikes. It shows that drone warfare is moving into a more organized phase in which control over timing is becoming almost as important as control over firepower. The point is no longer only to punish exposed movement after it begins. It is to prepare for that movement before it starts and strike when the target is most vulnerable. And once drone ambushes are organized with that level of intent, the purpose of the strikes also begins to widen. They are no longer only about destroying one vehicle at a time, but about disrupting the larger rhythm that keeps forces behind the front operating at all. What matters most in Lyman is not only that Russian vehicles are being destroyed, but that these strikes are hitting the system that keeps frontline units alive. A truck carrying logs, boards, or construction material may seem less important than a combat vehicle, yet its loss can shape the battle in quieter and longer-lasting ways. If those materials do not arrive, defensive positions remain unfinished, trenches stay weaker, and shelters meant to protect troops from artillery and drone attacks are left incomplete. That means one strike can damage not only transport, but also the future strength of the position it was supposed to support. The same logic applies to resupply vehicles carrying ammunition, water, fuel, batteries, food, tools, and parts. These are the items that keep soldiers effective under pressure, and without them, even a unit still standing can begin to lose its ability to function properly. Once such a vehicle is destroyed, the effect does not end with the burning wreck on the road. The men waiting ahead may lose rounds needed for defense, fuel for generators, batteries for radios, optics, or drones, and basic items that allow them to endure another day in position. In a hard-fought sector, small shortages rarely stay small for long. A delayed delivery can weaken observation, slow communication, reduce fire discipline, and force troops to ration what should have arrived on time. The pressure becomes even more serious when troop transport is hit. A vehicle carrying replacement soldiers is part of the cycle that allows tired troops to rotate out, fresh troops to rotate in, and vulnerable positions to remain occupied without breaking under exhaustion. If that cycle is interrupted, the same soldiers may be forced to stay longer under stress, with less rest and fewer options when the next threat appears. That creates weakness before a new assault begins. This is why the repeated destruction of support vehicles in Lyman should be seen as more than a series of tactical successes. It points to a broader Ukrainian effort to attack the supply chain behind the battlefield itself. The goal is not simply to destroy whatever happens to be moving on a road. The deeper purpose is to interrupt the flow that connects rear areas to the men holding exposed ground near the front. When that flow is cut, tasks are delayed, repairs do not happen on time, positions are left unfinished, and units begin to lose the rhythm that allows them to operate smoothly under pressure. A single destroyed vehicle can therefore create effects far beyond its size or price. It can leave cargo undelivered, disrupt rotation schedules, force commanders to improvise, and place extra strain on troops who are already exposed. That is what gives these strikes their larger meaning. They are attacking the daily process of movement, supply, repair, and reinforcement that allows Russian forces to keep fighting over time. And when logistics begins to tighten in that way, pressure from Ukrainian UAVs does not stop at vehicles and supply routes, because it naturally starts moving toward the tools that keep the whole front able to fight. What stands out in this phase of the fighting is that Ukrainian drone pressure is no longer limited to vehicles moving near the front, because it is now reaching the weapons and systems that help Russia keep the wider battlefield functioning. One important sign of that shift is the growing use of UAVs against Russian artillery. These strikes matter because artillery supports infantry, suppresses positions, and helps Russian forces hold ground when direct movement becomes difficult. When drones begin finding guns hidden under cover, netting, or rough camouflage, they challenge the idea that artillery can stay protected simply by being placed behind the first line. In one reported case, a drone struck directly into the barrel of a gun. That detail matters because a weapon can be made useless by hitting one key point with precision, and that may be enough to remove fire support at the exact moment it is needed most. That means the effect of drones is spreading from the roads behind the front to the systems that shape the battle itself. A force that receives less ammunition, fewer replacements, and weaker gun support is exposed to a deeper form of erosion. Its ability to respond or stabilize the situation becomes weaker even before a larger clash begins. But the significance of this drone campaign extends beyond Lyman and beyond artillery. Ukraine is also using interceptor drones against Shahed-type attacks, aimed at cities and infrastructure in the rear. That shows the same technological logic working on two levels at once. On one level, drones hunt movement, logistics, and fire support close to the battlefield. On another, drones act as a lower-cost defensive layer against long-range aerial threats that appear at night. This matters because it connects tactical pressure at the front with strategic protection in the rear. It also means commanders must now think about defense in a wider way, because the same drone war that disrupts guns and convoys can also protect cities, grids, and infrastructure. What emerges from that pattern is not a set of isolated drone incidents. It is a picture of war being reorganized by systems that can find, strike, and intercept across very different layers of the conflict. And when the same kind of technology can both weaken movement near the front and help defend the sky behind it, the battlefield begins to look less like separate zones and more like one connected space controlled increasingly from above. Lyman shows that modern war is no longer defined only by who holds ground first. It is increasingly defined by who can see, track, and disrupt the enemy across every layer of movement and support. What makes this shift so serious is that the danger now reaches beyond a single strike or one destroyed vehicle. It affects the flow of men, supplies, fire support, and protection in ways that weaken the system behind the front. That is the broader meaning of what is happening here. Ukraine is using UAVs not just to destroy targets, but to compress the battlefield, shorten reaction time, and make survival harder during every stage of combat. If this pattern continues, the issue in Lyman will not only be how much ground Russia can hold. It will be how long it can function under a sky that never stops watching. That question may define the sector. War is not only about weapons and territory, but about the human cost that grows every time conflict is allowed to continue. Understanding the battlefield matters because it helps people see both how modern war works and why peace remains so important. Subscribe to Military Force for more analysis, and remember that every lesson from war should also be a lesson about the value of peace.